Hello, welcome back. So today I'm going to explain the Heart as a Pump lecture, which is Dr. Francis's first lecture. He only has 3 objectives for this lecture. The first one is to understand the cardiac cycle. The second one is to understand the cardiac output, how to calculate that, and what parameters affect said cardiac output. So the cardiac cycle is what we've been learning since like form function 1 or 2. But to rehash it, it's when you're going to have your cranial and caudal vena cavas, and they're going to bring the deoxygenated blood from the body and dump it into your right atrium. Once your right atrium has higher pressure than your right ventricle, it's going to allow blood to flow through this tricuspid valve. Then the right ventricle is going to pump blood through this pulmonary valve into your pulmonary arteries. These arteries and veins are the only arteries and veins in the whole blood that have switched function. So these pulmonary arteries are going to actually handle deoxygenated blood, and once we get to these lungs and get oxygenated, the oxygenated blood comes back via pulmonary veins. These pulmonary veins are then going to go into this left atrium, which is going to send the blood to the left ventricle via the mitral valve, and the left ventricle is going to pump out through the aortic valve, out into the aorta, and out into the body. Once that oxygenated blood gets to your muscles and to wherever it needs to go, that's going to run via arteries and then arterioles. It's going to find a capillary, and once we find that capillary, then we start running via venules and veins and whatnot. These veins are then going to all rehash and come through the cranial or caudal vena cavas and start the process over again. Before I start even talking about the rest of the lecture material, we should know some key points. So the atria and the ventricles, the 2 atria are going to contract together, and the 2 ventricles are going to contract together. So it's not 1 atria, 1 ventricle, one, no. 2 atria contract together, 2 ventricle contract together. Then another thing we should understand is the concept of systole and diastole. So systole is when we're contracting and we're pumping blood, and then diastole is when we're relaxing and receiving blood. You can imagine that when you're relaxing, you're decreasing pressure, like when you're relaxing in bed watching Netflix, you're decreasing pressure off your body, and when you're in systole and you're contracting, you're increasing said pressure. And then some terminology, so your AV valves are your AV valves is the mitral and tricuspid valve, and then your semilunar valves is your pulmonary and aortic valves. Okay, then when we come over here, these are the more specific phases of said cardiac cycle. So right here, we're gonna have the 2 phases of the systole cycle and then the 4 phases of diastole. So right here, when he talks about this toast thing in class, we're mainly talking about what the ventricle is doing here. So when the ventricle is in systole and when the ventricle is in diastole. But you can imagine that while this is going on, the atria is in diastole and the atria is in systole, vice versa. Okay, so our first step, which starts over here at the end of the toast, the first step is going to be your isovolemic contraction. So iso for same, volemic for volume, and contraction for contracting. So we're gonna have same volume contraction. Remember I mentioned that when you're contracting, you're increasing your pressure. So same volume, increased pressure. Once you have that contraction, when your volume stays exactly the same but you're increasing your pressure, what you're doing is you're waiting for your pressure to be higher than where you're trying to go. Because blood flow will always flow from high pressure to low pressure. So when we're contracting in this isovolemic contraction, we get to a good enough high pressure to when we then enter our ejection phase, and that's when we're actually going to pump the blood out. When we pump the blood out, our volume of course is going to start to decrease because we're running out of blood, but the pressure is going to increase and slowly decrease. Once that pressure slowly decreases, we're going to enter diastole because we need to refill ourselves. So when we refill ourselves, we're going to enter this stage of isovolemic relaxation. So same volume, low pressure. So we have a low pressure and we're trying to get some volume, so we're relaxing. When we relax and we have low enough pressure, remember our atrium was just filling. So now it has enough blood to fill us. So when we're relaxing, we have such low pressure and the atrium has such high pressure, we go from high to low. So that's when we have that rapid filling phase right here, because we're going from high to low pressure. And then once that pressure starts to equalize, we're gonna have a slow fill. And then once the atria is like, I can't handle this no more, I'm completely empty, I have basically no blood left, that's when the atrium is gonna contract to squeeze what little blood it has left and then relax to start to fill itself. And that's when our ventricle will then enter the systole and then pump all the blood that the atria just gave it. So here is that toast picture where we have that isovolemic, volume constant, but pressure increases. We eject, then we have that isovolemic relaxation where volume is exactly the same, but pressure decreases, rapid filling, low filling, and then atria contracts. Okay? And then he specifically said that he was gonna ask what marks the beginning of systole and what marks the beginning of diastole. And what marks the beginning of systole is when those AV valves close, and then when we're gonna refill, we want those semilunar valves to close because we're refilling ourselves. Okay. Then is this concept of cardiac output. These are where the equations come into play. So for starters, we need to know what cardiac output is. Cardiac output is basically just the total blood pumped by each ventricle in 1 minute. So with your left and right ventricle pumps in 1 minute, that's gonna be your cardiac output. Then we have stroke volume, which is the amount of blood that's ejected out of the heart during each heartbeat. And then we have heart rate, which is just how many, beats in a minute. So the simple equation is stroke volume times heart rate. But your stroke volume, remember, it's the amount of blood ejected during each heartbeat. So that's during systole and diastole. So at the end of diastole, what's your volume? At the end of systole, what's your volume? Subtract those two, and then you'll get your stroke volume. That stroke volume, you're gonna multiply it by your heart rate, and that's how you get your cardiac output. So what can affect said cardiac output, which is your last objective? So right here, all of these are going to be what are going to increase your cardiac output. And he did mention specifically that he will ask you a question on this. You increase the diastolic volume, so you're increasing how much volume you have when you relax. You can imagine if you increase the volume you have when you're relaxing, that moment you contract, you just pumped out more blood. So you just increased your cardiac output. However, if we decrease what we have at the end of systole, remember systole is when you're contracting. So if you decrease how much you have left when you contracted, that means you're basically empty. You just contracted everything you have left. So you're decreasing your systole. You have nothing left when you're in systolic. So then that's also going to increase cardiac output because you ejected everything you have. You just gave all your blood away. So you're increasing that cardiac output because you're increasing the amount of blood that you just ejected out. So that means like you increase the contractibility and all that stuff. Then obviously if you increase your heart rate, you're pumping more blood. So you're increasing your cardiac output as well. All of these things are going to increase cardiac output. That's what he focused on in class. You can imagine if you do the reverse of all of these things, then you would decrease cardiac output. And then the last thing that I wanted to cover were these pressures. I'm not sure if he wants us to memorize them, but I put them here just in case. So basically the important part to know is that your left side of your heart is going to be that high pressure side. The right side is the low pressure side. So if you're in a multiple choice question and you're in doubt, left high, right low. And then you also need to know that your aortic pressure is never going to reach zero. That's going to be your 120 and 80 diastolic. That's never going to hit zero, your aortic pressure. However, when you're in that ventricular pressure, those can reach zero. So your systole will be 120 for the left and 25 for the right, but your diastole will be in zero. And that's pretty much it. Thank you.